Good evening. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute. I want to welcome you to the Baker Institute and to this event tonight. As you know, the three countries in North America recently renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, now known, or at least temporarily known, as the USMCA agreement. And many of us are still trying to figure out exactly what it contains and where it's going to lead the future of trade in North America, where exactly we will end up. So this is the Baker Institute's first take at this USMCA agreement. So to welcome our guests tonight, let me introduce to you the director of the Center for Public Finance, John Diamond. John.
Thank you. And so before I introduce our two distinguished guests, I was going to give a 5-minute talk of a 50-minute lecture that I would give to Econ 100 students here at Rice University on trade. And this will serve as the framework for what I think will be a very informative discussion. So the gains from trade. Are there gains from trade? Well, Benjamin Franklin said, no nation was ever ruined by trade, even seemingly the most disadvantageous. So obviously there's some positive gain from trade. In Econ 100, we would set up the most simple example in the world to prove to students, or at least to get students thinking about the gains from trade. So we may look at two countries, Canada and the United States, producing two goods, dairy and beef. And in this example, it takes 1 hour for Canada to produce dairy and 4 hours for them to produce beef. And for the U.S., it takes them 2 hours to produce dairy and 2 hours to produce beef. That means that if each country has 100 workers, Canada could produce either 100 units of dairy or 25 units of beef. The United States could produce 50 units of dairy or 50 units of beef. And as economists, we would then say, well, what are the relative costs of producing either beef or dairy? Well, for Canada, 1 unit of beef costs 1/4 unit of dairy, or we'd say the opportunity cost of dairy is 1/4 of a unit of beef. And for the United States, the opportunity cost of a unit of dairy is 1 unit of beef. And so we would say that the United States would have a comparative advantage in the production of beef, where the opportunity cost is only 1 unit of dairy versus Canada's opportunity cost of 4 units of dairy. You can produce beef more cheaply in the U.S. than you can in Canada. There's a relative cost advantage. And for Canada, Canada would have the comparative advantage in producing dairy. The opportunity cost of dairy is 1/4 of a unit of beef versus 1 unit of beef for the U.S. So you move forward. Let's just take some normal production in Canada and the U.S. Again, a completely hypothetical example. In this case, Canada using all 100 hours, they produce 60 units of dairy and 10 units of beef. The U.S. produces 20 units of dairy and 30 units of beef. So total production is 80 units of dairy, 40 units of beef. What happens, so that's a world without trade. What happens as we move to a world with trade? And so we often say free trade. Well, what does free trade mean for economists? Free trade for economists is what happens when the countries specialize in producing the good they have the comparative advantage for, i.e. the good that they can produce relatively more cheaply than the other country. In this case, Canada would produce dairy because they do that relatively more cheaply than the United States. Canada could produce 100 units of dairy. The United States would produce beef because they do that relatively more cheaply than Canada. The United States could produce 50 units of beef. If we compare the before trade and the after trade scenarios, we see that total production would increase by 20 units of dairy and 10 units of beef, and we call those the gains from trade. And that's what we use to start students thinking about if countries specialize in the goods they're most efficient at producing And then trade, you're going to have gains from trade. And those gains from trade show up as increases in consumption. So that's one big topic. The second topic we've heard a lot about recently is trade deficits. And are trade deficits important? Where do they come from? And so when we look at that, what's the mechanics of a trade deficit? And specifically, how do we solve this problem? Can we solve a trade deficit problem by bilateral trade agreements? Is that the way we should attack this issue, or is there some other public policy issue at the play here? Well, a simple model of the economy, or a simple just arithmetic of the economy, y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, i.e. y being gross output, c being consumption, I being investment, g's government spending, m is imports, and x is exports. We're just saying that total output in the economy is equal to everything consumers consume, all the investment in the economy, what the government spends, plus whatever we produce that we export to other countries, and whatever we buy from other countries that we import and consume in the U.S. And so we can move, just simple mathematics, moving the C and the G over, we get Y minus C and G, so total output minus private consumption and minus government consumption leaves you with I equals net export, or I plus net exports. Well, Y minus C and G, total output minus everything we consume, is just what you save. So savings is equal to Y minus C minus G. We replace that and we get net exports equals S minus I. That's a very fundamental concept. So net exports is equal to national savings minus investment. So if you think about the United States, we have a bunch of profitable investments that people would like to make. And we also have some amount that we save. If our savings are less than the number of profitable investments, then net exports is going to be negative, i.e. you're going to run a trade deficit. No bilateral trade agreement is going to stop that. If you want to stop the trade deficit, there's a simple way to do that. You save more, or in our case, you consume less and you have a smaller budget deficit, or you increase private savings. So trade deficits are related to savings and investments in countries, not necessarily bilateral trade agreements. And that's when we look at this graph of the U.S. trade deficit that has been negative since 1971, which is right around the time that the Bretton Woods situation ended. This is where we can start thinking more clearly about free trade agreements and their effects when we know that trade deficits are not caused by trade agreements, nor are they solved by trade agreements. It's a larger fiscal policy issue of equating national savings with national investment opportunities. So now we're going to get to the specifics at hand, which is talking about the USMCA. We're honored to have two very distinguished guests. His Excellency Bruno Ferrari, who's the former Secretary of the Economy of Mexico, and the Honorable Carlos Gutierrez, the former Secretary of Commerce for the United States. And so I will come over and join you, and we will just start with some simple questions and work our way up to more difficult questions. So I really just want this to end up being y'all talking more than me, so I just did all my talking, but let's just begin with the most obvious question. Did NAFTA need to be renegotiated? Was it the worst deal ever? So that could be one reason it needed to be renegotiated. Or was it that NAFTA was written 25 years ago in 1993 and the world is much different in 2018 than in 1993? That could be another reason it needed to be renegotiated. So,
Bruno,
thank you for having me. To answer this in few words, I will just say that NAFTA was need to be modernized, not necessary to renegotiate. Because, as I said, you always know the results of something if you look at the numbers. And the numbers of NAFTA for the three countries have been wonderful.
I would say the same thing. The purpose should have been modernized. It was a 25-year-old agreement, so we didn't have an e-commerce chapter. We didn't have a very robust IPR chapter. So yeah, there were areas where you could modernize a 25-year-old agreement, but I don't believe it had to be renegotiated because it was the worst agreement in the world. This is NAFTA is $1.5 trillion. If you look at the economy of Canada, U.S., and Mexico before NAFTA and after NAFTA, the three countries are doing better. It's hard to explain to someone in a local community that loses their job because of trade, but for the country as a whole, NAFTA has been a wonderful thing.
So what, in the new agreement, if either of you could lay out maybe the specifics, how does the USMCA compare to NAFTA in its basic changes?
Well, I'll say a couple. I'm sure Bruno has more. It has 12 more chapters, so it's more. The scope has increased. There's a chapter on small business, a chapter on e-commerce, a chapter on IPR, a chapter on corruption. So in that regard, it's a bigger scope. There are two changes that are the most significant. One is rules of origin for automobiles, which essentially it requires that 75% of the components of a car come from North America. But the part that is difficult for Mexico is that 40 to 45% has to be made by labor that makes $16 an hour. I don't know any laborer in Mexico who makes $16 an hour. So that means that production will have to move out of the U.S. The other thing that is a concern is the dispute settlement mechanisms. It's been watered down substantially, so companies don't have the protections, U.S. companies, that they once did. And that's a concern to many. There's also a 6-year watered down sunset clause, but every 6 years, someone can decide to leave NAFTA. I don't know if you want to add. Would you like to add?
Yeah, well, definitively, free trade is the key for progress in the world. Before and now, and I think that is going to be forever. Just think in Mexico. In the NAFTA agreement, most of the exports of Mexico were oil. Nowadays is the opposite. And just for you to have in mind a concept, just think that if you put together all the exports of all the countries of Latin America, they are even less than the exports of just Mexico. So you can imagine how important was that for the three countries. And especially, I have to say, since I'm here, the most important exporter for Mexico and US is Texas. And in the case of Mexico, it's Jalisco. No? So just thinking the changes of that. And I do believe that this issue of the sunset clause was one of the key points of the discussion, because everybody, for doing their budgets, their investments, needs certainty on how long this is going to be and to make their plans. And now we have a framework of 16 years, then another year to review, and then again. So at least you have certainty in what you are doing. And I agree with you, Secretary, that the most important issue is not just going to be the labor cost, but the labor itself. Because in this new agreement, Mexico commits to have a major changes. So Mexico, and I see this as a challenge, Mexico needs to make huge changes in the federal labor law, which I believe is going to be very, very tough. And I'm trying to keep this in technical basis to not enter in the political issues and those things. But you can imagine the strength of the unions, not just here, but also there. And this means that for the unions need to choose their leaders with democracy and things that I see a difficult environment for the future when politicians are going to have these kind of discussions over there. So for me, this is the most important issue. I also just think that we went from 22 to 34 different chapters, and I believe the intellectual property is a very important one.
So let's go back to the one issue you brought up, the automotive issue, because I've read some stuff on that. And so the new rule is that 75% has to be produced here in the or 75% of the components have to be produced in North America, and then there's this 30 to moving up to 40% that has to be paid a wage of $16 per hour. One of the things I read is, so currently a car that's produced in Mexico, assembled in Mexico, that is then sold in the U.S. is actually, some of the research I've seen is 74% of its components are produced in the United States, whereas the same car that's sold to Germany, only 18% of its components would be produced in the United States. And the point being that there are global supply chain issues at play within Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. So there are parts flowing back and forth to build a car. Is it possible that this could actually backfire and disrupt the supply chain? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, it's going to be incredibly difficult to manage. How do you manage what component was made with $16 an hour? But it will benefit Canada and the U.S. because they both pay $16 an hour. Whether that specific component is being produced in Canada at the moment, and it's going to get more complex with time, but it will move jobs from Mexico to the U.S., but it will make U.S. cars more expensive. So the theory is that there's a Section 232 pending decision that would put tariffs on all automobiles coming into the U.S. From around the world. And it almost seems that the only way for the U.S. to protect its industry is to do that. So you can imagine what that would do to world supply chains and what that would do to the price of autos in the U.S. if autos had to pay tariffs going in. So that could be an unintended consequence, and it could well be part of of the strategy of using this 232 for autos as leverage to negotiate with Germany, to negotiate with Japan, and using that as as the stick.
That raises another interesting question. So one of the new chapters added was an enforcement mechanism or a clause that said before you sign a new trade agreement with a non-market economy, which I think is just China.
Yeah,
there's only one we're worried about. that members of you, that some members will be able to pull out if you do that, and there has to be this notification. Is that a good thing to have in a trade agreement?
Well, this is very much part of where the president has pivoted. He's done NAFTA, the new USMCA, and now it's China. And his pivot is to China. And in our national security strategy, we mentioned that China's rise has not been good for the U.S. and that China is more than just a competitor. So, we've told China, your rise is not good for us. And this is just one more way of trying to keep China out of the region, but also try to isolate them. So I think the agreement says if you have the intention of doing an FTA with China, or with a non-market economy, by the way, Russia's a non-market, is a market economy, then you have to inform the members, and the members can decide to leave at that point. So it's another kind of leverage point, another club.
Another first in this agreement is it's the first trade agreement to include a clause about currency manipulation, which is almost certainly also geared right towards the China issue. What do you think about that?
Well, there are two things here that are relatively new. One is the labor rates, and the other one is actually inserting this currency clause. They don't mention what the remedy is and what the enforcement is, but there's no question. This is targeted very much at countries like China, who have used currency to be able to export more. So it's interesting. A lot of what's in the new NAFTA sends a message to China. And you're going to see that the next 3, 6, 12 months is all about this trade war with China. So it was important for the president to get NAFTA done, and now the focus is the real focus, which is China.
I think you're right there. Reading through it, one of the things that struck me is so the currency issue, the issue on there's an issue in the agreement on intellectual property rights, which is taken straight out of the TPP agreement, which, as I read through it and saw several of the other issues that were very closely related to what would have been in TPP, I couldn't help but wonder, would we have all been better off if we had just stayed in TPP as opposed to passing USMCA? So, or is the president playing a game in which he wants to get certain things, and he has a strategy, so to speak? What's your view on the USMCA agreement versus an overall TPP agreement? What would be better?
I believe he's negotiating. He's sending messages everywhere about how this is going to be done. Nevertheless, I have to say that at the end, U.S. customers are the ones that are going to pay for. And I believe this is quite an issue. Because as more obstacles they put in trade, the more expensive the cars are going to be for all of you.
Yeah. At TPP, just, I'm not sure how much you're aware of this, but this was the decision to pull out was made by the president 3 days after he was elected. So it was a very quick decision. He had promised he would do it. He thought it was a terrible trade agreement. TPP essentially was an upgrading of NAFTA plus countries on the Pacific, Chile.
18 countries.
Yeah?
18 countries.
18 countries, and then countries in Asia. Singapore, Australia, Vietnam. It was Japan.
Indonesia, Singapore.
And so this was an important strategic move for the U.S. We are very underrepresented in Asia. We have an agreement with Korea, South Korea, Singapore, and then Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand. This is 60% of the world's population, 60% of the world's economy. It's the fastest growing, largest economy in the world, if you take Asia. We are shut out by that decision on TPP. So you're right. TPP was an upgrade of NAFTA.
Yes.
And that could have very easily, happened, and we stay in TPP. Now, I don't know how we get back into Asia, because manufacturers will be shut out from Asia unless they want to pay tariffs going in, or unless they build a factory in Asia. So I personally think, and I don't want to sound political, but I think that's probably the one decision that I think we will regret over time, because China, on the other hand, has filled the void. They have their own free trade agreement to unite all of Asia. So they're going to write the rules, they're going to lead the way, and Asian countries actually wanted us to be in there because they want the U.S. as a counterbalance to China. We're out.
Is there any chance that Mexico and Canada join a trade agreement with one of the Asian trade agreements and leave or allow the U.S. to opt out of the USMCA? Even
Mexico did sign TPP. Okay. And just to give you another data, you were talking about dairy products. Just New Zealand, this tiny country, which is part of also of the TPP, produces more milk than Canada. Actually, I can say that just one company in New Zealand produces more milk than all Canada. So imagine how important it is for Canada also to be part of these discussions.
Yeah. So what happened with the TPP it was a 12-country agreement, and with the U.S. pulling out, now it's an 11-country agreement. And Japan stepped up and took the lead. And they decided to do that instead of pursuing a free trade agreement with the U.S. And I think it was the right call because they're keeping TPP alive, and they've left an opening there for the U.S. to come back in.
So I don't want to monopolize all the questions, so we'll open the floor to the audience for a few questions. So if anybody would like to jump in.
Dave Smith. Hey, you three represent I'm sure Dr. Diamond. You represent a collection of rent seekers in our society, right? Rent seekers. I'm sure Dr. Diamond knows what a rent seeker is.
I do. Yeah. I don't represent anybody except myself.
I mean, think about it. In the last 40 years, the average CEO made 30 times salary. Now he makes $325. The American worker the manufacturing job was making $1250. The replacement job is $400. Right? You go to Mexico and they have these, what they call them, protection contracts, which suppress Mexican labor wages, right? So that the profits flow to the CEOs and the executive. So, you guys talk about free trade, but really it's mercantilism, right? So how do you justify the continuation of these agreements when they've been clearly a loser for the American worker?
Well, let me take that last part first, a loser for the American workers. Manufacturing as a percent of GDP has been about 12 to 14% for a long time. The labor force that is in manufacturing is only 8% of the labor force. So 12 to 14% of the output, 8% of the labor. The biggest part of that is technology. What I worry about is that we're focused on bringing steel back. We're focused on, industries that are important, but we're not focused on technology. And that's going to come back to haunt us. On your point on CEOs, I was a CEO. I agree with you. I think some of these packages are just exaggerated. They're outrageous. I don't know what you do about it, but I wouldn't blame that on trade. I mean, that's a separate issue. It doesn't mean because CEOs sometimes earn a ridiculous amount of money. I wouldn't throw trade out because of that.
Yeah, I mean, if you stopped all trade, yes, CEOs would make a lot less money, but American workers would also be consuming a lot less. You're looking at one side, and I'm not saying there are tremendous losers from trade. The gains from trade, and that was part of the Econ 101 story, is there are tremendous gains from trade. But don't let the aggregate gain mask what's underneath, which is there are winners and losers. And we haven't done a great job of allocating the gains from trade across workers that lose. And you see this in parts of the country that have done the worst. And I think that's why the current president probably got elected, because he spoke to the workers who felt like they had been shafted. And that they weren't experiencing any of the gains from trade. But I think overall, if you look in aggregate, we can see the gains from trade. I don't disagree that there have been rent seekers and that manufacturing employment has seen a big decline. I think that's partly because of trade and partly because of automation.
I believe this is also related with the policies of benefits which have been changing during time, and I believe that what was done is that the CEOs were putting the carrot in front instead of the stick, no? And I believe that in a way was right, but sometimes the size of the carrot moves the car down, no? And this needs to be reflected. But of course, trade benefits all. Just trade of NAFTA means, in terms of GDP, 50% for United States, 34% for Canada, and close to 80% for Mexico.
I wonder if one of the responses to the critic of mercantilism is that the real worry, the real issue is automation and robotics. And you mentioned, Secretary Gutierrez, about technology. I mean, the number of jobs, American workers that are displaced through automation and robotics and artificial intelligence, that's really a tremendous issue. If you look at some of the warehouses that some of the big bulk stores are importing out, they're robots that are finding the products. It's not people. So I wonder if the real issue is a policy question about how do you deal with the challenge of technology as it relates to the impact on workers. My view of the CEO issue is that I agree with the statistics are clear. The carrots become humongous. But I think that's more of an issue of a failure of corporate governance and the boards of directors of the big companies to stop what is happening and to go along to get along on the board. And that is an issue, I think, of American capitalism. It's a problem because it's not had the check and balance that you would expect from, and these are very high quality. You look at the resumes of the board members of these public companies, they are A+, but they have not done their job as it relates to checking extreme and humongous carrots. Yeah, the question I have, though, is there's been a lot of concern. I mean, we're in Houston, we're in Texas. There are a lot of Houston companies that are going to benefit tremendously from participating in energy reform in Mexico. I mean, the reform in Mexico was not just a one-in-a-generation event, it was a one-in-3 generations event. And it is a tremendous opportunity for Texas and for Houston companies in particular. And I think, the one chapter in NAFTA that relates to the Mexicans reserving the rights and the hydrocarbons under the substrata, I wonder what your view is, because there's been a lot of discussion about the implementation of the changes in the USMCA to lock in the very important energy reform in Mexico as it relates to the progress of letting companies come in. And so I wonder what your view is on that topic, because it's critical, I think, to the future of the opening and of Houston and Texas companies' participation in Mexico.
Yeah, I'll let Secretary Ferrari answer the energy question. On policy of technology, I think you are right, absolutely right, and you've got your finger on something that needs to be elevated. We're talking about trade deficits, we're talking about automobiles, it's all great. But we're not talking about what are we going to do when millions of workers lose their job. So do we need training centers around the country? Do we need to hold private companies accountable to retrain their workers? What is the policy? What is the strategy? But this is like a one-time, maybe in history of tremendous disruptive change. And we're not talking about it. And right now, today, 70% of the world's robots are Korea, Japan, and China. And it's national policy, and they want to lead the world. The private sector is investing, but we need more government to get in and do the research, which the private sector typically doesn't have the financial patience and the competitive environment to invest for 15 years without getting a return. I can tell you I'm on 3 boards. I was on 4 boards until recently. And none of those boards do CEOs make these ridiculous amounts. And there's a lot of pressure. I mean, today the toughest job on a board is to be the chairman of the comp committee, because you have a lot of scrutiny. But you still have outliers, and you still have these incredible, you still have these incredible salaries. Yes, sir. Ambassador, how are you?
For me, what you are saying should be the nightmare of the people that are thinking and moving the economy of this country. Because more than China, I believe the use of technology and how to be prepared for that technology has to be a real challenge.
What's your view on the energy topic, the locking in of the energy reform in Mexico?
Thinking on that side, that is also something very important of this agreement. And of course, Texas is going to benefit a lot from that, coming from that, because Mexico was already changing many aspects in the energetical reform, but it's going to move faster now with this issue of the new NAFTA. And we are talking not just about oil, we are talking about all kinds of energy, which is going to be very important.
So your view is that USMCA does lock in energy privatization in Mexico, does lock in those changes?
Even with the new president and the new administration going in?
No, he's going to keep moving on that direction.
Okay.
And they have been already done.
In the direction of allowing private investment.
For me, the challenge, more than that, is even tougher, the labor issues, as I say, the unions.
Yeah, I really kind of appreciate you both for your being here. Supposed to follow up with your question. Energy is a big part of the trade balance between U.S. and Mexico, and the opportunity would be, as you suggest, a lot of oil-field tools and services flowing south from the U.S. And I'm encouraged that you're saying that this will continue, but many people north of the border don't know that Mexico actually has a national holiday celebrating the expropriation of the oil of the U.S. oil business back in 1938, and I'm encouraged by your words that this process will continue, but I can see how it could be very easily demagogued by your politicians to sort of wrap themselves back in this expropriation. And so I'm just kind of curious, is that really going to move forward, especially with AMLO coming in?
I believe that this is moving forward, and it needs to be moving forward, because when you are talking about the economy of a country, there are many different tools that you have to move. If you take money from one side to put in another side, where is going to be the money of this side? So you have to be careful when you are doing that. And that aspect, I believe, has been in discussions since 38, as you say, since the expropriation. And I will be, as I said, I'm not talking about as a government or politician. I'm talking about as a technician or academic now. And I will say that I'm pretty confident that this is going to continue. And there are already some things going on.
So we're over here, and then the young lady in the middle.
Right. We're just about 3 weeks away or so from the elections, and there will be a change in Congress for sure. I'm not sure what it will be, but my question is really a reality check. When you get the rhetoric and you put reality onto it, do you expect, I think Mexico will sign the treaty. The question is, will the U.S. sign the agreement, ratify, and I'll just throw in Canada for good measure. Question basically is, are we going to have, perfect or imperfect though it may be, are we going to have the new version of the North American Free Trade Agreement?
Yeah, that's a good question, because Mexico will ratify, Canada will ratify, but then it's not going to be done in the lame duck session. There's not enough time. So if the Democrats take the House, would they oppose the agreement? We know that labor unions are not wild about the agreement, but would it be politically more dangerous to oppose it than to take a vote in favor of trade? The irony is that it was the Republican Party that was the pro-trade party. And it'll be interesting to see if Democrats actually fill that void. But that's the big question of the three countries, is ratification in the U.S.
Yes. I believe, as you were saying about uncertainty on Mexico, what Mexico has right now, especially more than the labor aspects and Canada and those things, is how does the Congress in the United States is going to react now on that issue. Because in the history of NAFTA, whenever the Congress was going to agree on the agreement, there was always someone who came with a new idea or something to change. And I'm sorry to say it, but your president is not one that make a decision and keeps just following that decision, no? I should not say that, but...
Well, I don't think he shocked anybody.
So this deal seems to kind of give Mexico the short end of the stick, like you were saying with the wage requirements, how some jobs from Mexico might move to the U.S. In that case, if all the jobs or a lot of jobs move, are there any protections for Mexican workers? Or how would that impact, I guess, the economy in Mexico?
We don't believe that this is going to necessarily happen, because as I said, at the end, the ones that are going to suffer with that is the American people, because all those goods are going to increase in their price. Which, let me just give you an example that happened to me. When we signed NAFTA, there was a clause talking about transports. I'm sure that you remember.
Yeah.
And the issue was that then, after 20 years, U.S. was not allowing transports of Mexico coming with their goods and those things. So there was the possibility of having a panel and discuss to make a decision. The panel gave the reason to Mexico, but it was a huge political aspect for U.S. So at the end, the agreement also provides cases of retaliation. No? In that case, I personally was coming to U.S. maybe more often than when you go to see your wife. And there were a lot of organizations and also governors, a lot of Congress people that were organizing some meetings in order to push United States to say yes to the transport. Otherwise, I made a huge list. I remember was 87 different products. So we began to retaliate with tariffs for all those products. So, okay, if transports are not allowed to pass, then apples coming from Washington are going to have these. And then we begin with all of different products. So you can imagine the mess and all those groups and companies pushing their Congress people and also their governors to do something in order to. And at the end, unfortunately, you always have different kind of sticks. So even there, which is not as powerful as the United States, we also have a little stick or a little chile, maybe, that can put some flavor into the stuff. And eventually, the United States decided to let pass the Mexican transports, which was a big issue.
So you mentioned earlier that you do think there will be a shift. How large of a shift do you think in U.S. production will come back because of the $16 wage? Because what I've read is it doesn't take effect until 2023. It's also not indexed for inflation, and the average wage in the U.S. is 22, so it's $6 less. That's about 3 times the average wage in Mexico. It seems like over a course of about 15 to 20 years, that'll be eaten away by inflation. So could companies be long-sighted enough to maintain their manufacturing sectors in Mexico and just take a hit?
Well, that's one option, is that, and that will be interesting to see, is whether you pay a duty, but you're still more competitive. At one point, there was an option of using the most favored nation tariff, but that's been taken out of the agreement. You don't have that option. Yeah.
And remember that it's not just the issue of the $16 per hour. It's also the issue of the technology. Mexico does not have cars named, Mexican design and Mexican intellectually invented. You don't have cars Perez or Lopez. Remember all the cars that Mexico are working on so it's also the policy that the companies have on their profits. So as I said, it's a very delicate, very delicate matter. So in the board of 4, are they going to decide that Mexican workers are going to have more money when they work there?
The question that you asked about worker protection? There's severance payments and things like that, but But again, I don't know if there's a national policy yet to be able to deal with displaced workers. So that's going to be an issue. It's interesting. I was just in Mexico about a week ago. No one is criticizing the Mexican negotiators for having given that up, because they knew that the Trump administration played this very well. They knew that Mexico had a deadline if they wanted the agreement to be signed before AMLO, which they did. And the U.S. played that deadline very well. So they had to, what people say is, look, we had no choice. We had to accept this. But your question is a good one, and I think your question goes back to the question on technology. What is our policy to be able to keep people working when their jobs have totally been eliminated?
If the auto companies decide to move, the wage rate up to $60, wouldn't that have an impact on other industries in Mexico? And how does the country deal with that in terms of their cost competitiveness with other countries other than the U.S. and Canada?
You mean that wages go up?
Yeah, so if the auto companies decide to invest and start and keep some of the production in Mexico, the wage rate goes up.
Oh, and pay the 16?
There's a contagion in other industries, and the wage rate therefore goes up there. They lose a competitive advantage. So
My only concern with that is that those companies may not be competitive anymore if they pay the $16.
in the auto business, no, in the rest, in the non-auto businesses.
Yeah, in other industries.
That goes to, one of the explanations in economics is that what you see over time is countries industrialize, and then they start running trade deficits, which a trade deficit, again, is when you have more investment opportunities than your society saves. So what happens? We run a current account deficit through net exports, but then on the capital account side, that has to offset the negative trade deficit. So you get investment from other countries into your country, which tends to raise wages, which makes labor-intensive technology shift out of that country. And so that's what we saw a lot in the U.S.
And should be part of the management of a company, because some politicians now in Mexico are talking of doing this by decree. And this is not something which a government said, now everybody is going to win $16 an hour. Maybe will be a very good politician activity, but this will destroy the companies.
So on the trade deficit, I think it's important to focus on what you just said, because this has been what's been driving U.S. policy. And right or wrong, the president believes that if you have a surplus and we have a deficit, that either we negotiated a bad deal or you're taking advantage of us. The GDP statement is like a financial statement. And the trade deficit, as you mentioned, is called net exports. It's a line item. It's like if you were to say operating expenses is the most important thing in our business. What counts is growth. That's the bottom line. So it's interesting, the last time our trade deficit declined, and we saw that in the chart there, was during the Great Recession. Why? We had less commercial activity. The last time our trade deficit increased substantially was last quarter. Why? We had a great quarter. We're growing. So I would be very careful about what we wish for in terms of the trade deficit. It is not a proxy for anything. One last thing I'd say is we get the advantage of inexpensive goods, and that money usually comes back because the Chinese come back and invest it in the U.S. And they invest it at a very low interest rate. Treasury bills, interest rates are low. And that money is eventually going back into the system and invested at the cost of capital or more. So in that regard, I think we're getting a pretty good deal. But it's awfully difficult to convince the administration that trade deficits aren't the end game. And the more they are the end game, I think the more we're going to get ourselves in trouble and just have more unintended consequences.
To what you well said, Secretary, I will just add that I mean, U.S. is a very important country, and what is done in this country sets an example for many countries. What will happen is not just going back to the 70s or 60s, this issue of trade balance, which is very dangerous. Let me tell you an example that I lived in the past. Mexico exports a lot of cars to Argentina. A few years ago, when I was still in my work at the administration, Argentina perform a kind of kidnap of 2 ships of Nissan Mexicana, Nissan from Mexico, with 3,000 different cars. And Mrs. Cristina, the president of Argentina, came to me saying that Mexico was required to import the same amount that Argentina was paying for those cars in soya or grapes. So you can imagine the price of the cars, the Mexican cars in Argentina.
Yeah, I have a terrible trade deficit with my favorite restaurant, and I'm not sure how I can deal with that yet.
But you must have a trade surplus with someone. So you
Yeah,
sell your services
that's
to
right.
someone.
So
So we
it
all
all,
have trade deficits and trade surpluses. At the end, they equal out.
And it's not bad.
It's not
good.
bad, yeah.
It's a way of increasing the trade.
You probably enjoy the trade deficit with your favorite
Absolutely.
restaurant.
Which at the end, what you need to keep looking is how to increase your trade.
Yeah. Well, we have run out of time, and I am sorry. I know there were 2 questions we're not going to get to at least. I'm sure there are more.
Too bad.
But I want to thank our very prestigious guests. Thank you for sharing
Thank you.
your thoughts with us. And we would love to have you back sometime. And thank all of y'all for coming and skipping out on the Astros game to be here with us.